So limiters have been long heralded for their insane ability to push loudness without actually introducing much distortion or pumping effects. But in the last few years, there's been this craze of people instead turning to clippers to push their loudness even further, albeit with introducing a minor amount of distortion. So in this video today, I'm going to cover the difference between both of these and go over when you should be using each type of device. So let's dive into it. But before we do, it's important that you understand the controls of how a compressor works. That's why I'm giving you guys free access to our compression cheat sheet, which you can get right now in the description. This isn't like those normal cheat sheets that just look fancy but don't provide much value. This one goes through every single control you could possibly need to know. So that's really helpful. Grab that below. Let's get into it. Now today I've got this project open. This is the project I used for our How to Make Dubstep article, which I just published on the EDMProd blog. You can check that below if you like. And it sounds like this. So kind of balancing that aggressive yet deep sound. So really quick, I'm just going to dive into exactly what limiting and clipping are both doing. So a limiter basically applies a threshold at 0 dB and nothing is allowed to cross it. So you can see here, nothing is getting above that 0 dB line that gain reduction is applying to all the peaks there. The end result looks a lot like this, which is this waveform which is pretty loud and consistently nearing 0 dB, but doesn't quite ever, it keeps the dynamics pretty in check. The only problem with limiting is that if you push it very hard, it can introduce sorts of pumping effects like so. Now a transparent limiter like Pro L2, which I'll cover soon, actually minimizes this, but it still doesn't sound too great. It sounds very squashed. Other types of limiters include stock limiters such as Ableton's limiter. You've also got the Ozone Maximizer, which is a super common device, and these all provide limiting. But let's cover clipping. Now, a clipper is actually a form of distortion instead of compression. And basically anything that hits the threshold at the top there at 0 dB in this case, doesn't just not let it through, but it clips off right at the waveform. We can hear this, especially if we gain it up pretty high. So it actually is a form of very subtle but very real distortion. You can actually see here if we go into our waveform, I've just bounced out here, that the peaks are literally clipping off at 0 dB, meaning it's not like it's trying to massage the sound down. It's more of the hacksaw approach, just chop it off completely. Like that's the difference between clipping and limiting. The benefits of clipping though, however, is that it's really good on transient material where cutting off those peaks doesn't really make much of a difference to the sound. It's literally just kind of chopping off these unnecessarily short dynamics that we hear in the sounds. And it also avoids the pumping effect. You can hear in this clipping example, a lot of peaks are being cut off, but it's not really sounding that different, right? So it's very good result. Now, the good thing with both clipping and limiting is that they both provide what I like to call absolute control over your dynamics, meaning nothing gets through that 0 dB threshold. And I want to show you firstly that you can actually kind of have an in-between. You can actually use a limiter like a clipper. So I'm going to go ahead and solo just my drums here. And let's enable our audio effect track where I've got a bunch of different options loaded up. But I first want to show you Pro L2 here, because what I've done is I've changed a few of the settings so you can actually kind of treat it like a clipper. Now, the first thing you should know when you're using a limiter and trying to treat it like a clipper is that you want to have the minimum look ahead time. The minimum look ahead basically means that there's no time for the limiter to see what's coming before it can remove the gain reduction needle, basically. So it's instantly reacting to the audio, which means it's going to distort a bit more. Secondly, having attack and release, attack set to maximum so that the compression has no time to kick in, and the release so that if the compression does kick in over 10 whole seconds, which is very unlikely, it will instantly let go. And lastly, the important thing is to use a style of limiting, because all of these different limiters have different algorithms that achieve different results. You want to use one that sounds pretty, minimum pumping effects basically. And I find the transparent one kind of avoids pumping effects if I'm using Pro L2. And then basically we just gain up our drums. So let's see what this sounds like now. So you can start to hear that there's distortion being introduced, right? So that's a really cool way you can use a limiter as a clipper, but I'm gonna go through and show you this. There's still a difference between a limiter sound and a clipper sound. And so I'm gonna compare 2 limiters and 3 clippers here with you, just so you can really hear the difference. And then at the end, we'll kind of go over the differences between each of them and show you the best use cases for each type of processing. Now, I just wanna mention, if you really like this more advanced style of mixing tips and mastering tips, make sure to check out our Mixing for Producers course, which is, I'll leave a link for below. And basically that's an advanced course on mixing. We've got top level producers from labels like Anjuna, Deep and Spinning who've released on those labels and are breaking down their mix down. So check that out if you like. Okay, so I'm gonna go through these different examples. Let me solo firstly Ableton's limiter. Now I've once again tried to make this as close to a clipper as possible by making the look ahead time the minimum, the release time the minimum, and I'm using the same 5 dB gain boost into the limiter so you can hear what it sounds like. Let's first listen to it without any effects. Right? Now let's listen to it with Ableton's limiter engaged. Now, I am not a huge fan of Ableton's limiter, I'm not gonna lie. It's probably good for just ensuring nothing goes over 0 dB on a track level, but for mixing and mastering, I'm not really sure it's the best tool for the job because it introduces quite a lot of pumping and just does not sound the greatest. Even if we're to bring up this release a bit just to make it a bit smoother, and the look ahead, it just sounds really pumpy and gross, and it's because we're getting so much gain reduction on this meter. So it's not a very transparent limiter, and it doesn't sound like a great clipper either. The distortion it's introducing kind of sounds very inconsistent. It's kind of swaying between distortion and pumping, which is not really the best of both worlds. We're getting the worst of both worlds here with this one. So let's go into a concrete example, I suppose, which is going to be FabFilter Pro L2 using the settings I showed you before. Let's see how that sounds in comparison. And let's compare that to the limiter again, the Ableton limiter. So we actually get a louder and punchier result with the Pro L2. I definitely think Pro L2 can do a pretty good job as a clipper, but obviously, again, we could bring up our controls here and kind of bring them back to a kind of more standard set of controls. And the distortion goes away, but it's definitely not sounding as loud. And that is generally the way this works. Limiters kind of sacrifice the extra loudness that would be gained for, I guess, a consistent, non-distorted dynamics. But clippers kind of push things as loud as they possibly can. So let's compare our first clipper, which is actually a free plugin called G-Clip. One of my favorite ones I've used recently. It's a very simple clipping plugin. You can control basic parameters like gain, the clip level at 100% is just 0 dB, and the softness, which means basically you transition between hard clipping, which is just immediate cutoff, and soft clipping, which is more of an analog kind of clipping style, which is a lot softer. Obviously not as loud, but hey, there's a trade-off there. And I got a little bit of softness here, and let's see how this sounds in comparison to Pro L2. So we actually get punchier dynamics on the G clip here than the Pro L2. I really like the way that it basically preserves the feel of the drums. Like the dynamics don't feel super sacrificed, but there is distortion a lot, and there is quite a bit more than the Pro L2. That is the trade-off here. So it depends on how much distortion you want. And this will kind of get to my end point of the video in a second, because this is what I want to cover. But let's compare a couple of other saturators and clippers too, because there's a few different options in your different DAWs. I'm going to use Ableton Saturator here. Now, I'm not the biggest fan of this for this particular use case, and I'll show you why in a second, but let's listen to it first. Comparison to G clip. Now, the reason I'm not a fan of saturated is not because it doesn't sound okay. I think it sounds all right, but unfortunately, the settings only allow you to add 2 stages of clipping here. So I've got the analog clip mode just selected on saturated here, as well as the soft clip turned on the output, which is a bit of a shame, but it basically goes through this stage of analog clipping and then clips again on the master. And I can't just turn off the soft clip because for some reason it still goes over 0 dB if I do that. It's an alright plugin, especially for more just general distortion effects, but for this kind of loudness maximization, not really what we want to do. My favorite tool for the job in terms of Ableton stock is the glue compressor, which is a compressor, right? Not a soft clipping plugin. But I prefer just to literally use it as a makeup gain tool and use the algorithms on the soft clip output here, which sounds lovely. I actually prefer it to G-Clip personally, just because it sounds a little brighter. G-Clip tends to cut off, and this is the case with a lot of soft clipping. It cuts off a lot of the high end, but this one seems to still introduce, the high end into the signal, which is really cool. So let's see how this one compares to G-Clip. For me, it also seems to not distort the low end as much. That might be just the design of the circuitry of this clipper, but the low end stays intact more and the highs come through. So I'm like, that's a win-win for me. That's why I like to use it. The only downside to using glue compressor is that if your signal's hitting 0 dB, it's gonna still compress it a bit first. To be honest though, I kind of like that because I can shape the dynamics of my sound into the clipper. So if I want the transients to get really clipped, I can just basically crank the transients into the soft clipping and get a really punchy but controlled result. So glue compressor is probably one of my favorite, honestly, stock Ableton devices in general, but it's really good for soft clipping. Now, I've covered a few here. Make sure to comment below any other clipping or limiting plugins that I missed. Now, there's a few takeaways here I want to mention because we've gone through a few and I'm just like, okay, what now? My first recommendation, obviously we've been using this on drums and it's a very different result when we use it on the master. In fact, delete this one, on the master, the interaction, especially between the bass and the kick, can get quite muddy and quite gross. So let me just quickly show you this, especially with hard clipping. I'm gonna unsolo the drums. So clipping just drums is not really, obviously the only use case for a clipper. But if we use it on the master, you have to be really, really, really sparing. So my first recommendation is use the clipping on the individual buses rather than the master first. So I recommend using it on your drums definitely to get those drums pumping. Find the exact amount of gain that basically gets your loudness to where you want it to be without introducing too much distortion. It's important to use like headphones or a good referencing environment here because you really want to hear any amount of obvious distortion and minimize that basically. I also think it works well on bass. You just have to be very careful because you just want to warm up the bass a bit. You don't want to absolutely brutalize it because bass isn't really a dynamic element. A lot of the time it's just kind of a wafting thing. I don't really recommend using clipping on synths or effects groups or individual tracks. Maybe in some cases it makes sense, but in most of the case, it's just gonna add these really weird, unpleasant harmonics to sounds that don't really need them. I recommend just boosting the volume of your synth bus in comparison to your drums if they feel louder in the end. The second thing I recommend, which I already kind of touched on, is that you should maximize your clipping before using a limiter. So I think clipping has this really good ability, as we've heard based on the examples, to push our loudness actually further than a limiter can. But at some point it starts to reach a distorted phase. So once you hit that distortion, dial it back a bit and then use limiting to take you the rest of the way. If you do use clipping on your master, you have to be really sparing here. Just honestly, sometimes 1 dB of clipping just to push the loudness up, and then a limiter as the final thing, just to make sure nothing goes over 0 dB and pushing up the loudness to the maximum point it possibly can be. And number 3, use a good algorithm as your final limiter. You want to use one that's pretty transparent and doesn't use too much pumping effects. I recommend the modern and transparent algorithms in Pro L2. The IRC4 modern in Ozone is great as well if you're using Ozone. These tend not to add too much weird artifacts to your sounds while pushing the loudness as loud as possible. And that is it for our comparison of limiters and clippers. If you enjoyed this tutorial, there's 2 things you can do today. The first is to like this video because it will show it to more producers who need this kind of content to level up their production game. And second, you can subscribe so you can see more of what me and the EDMProd team is coming up with each week. We're putting out new content here, tutorials for you guys to up your production. Apart from that, hope this was good. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.